Welcome to another episode of Data Gurus. I'm so excited to have Cynthia Harris here, who is the founder, managing director of 828 Insights. Welcome, Cynthia. How are you?
I'm doing well, Sima. Thank you so much for asking. It's sunny here in Columbus today, and it's been a few weeks since we've had sunshine, so I'm in a good mood.
Oh, it's awesome because it's raining here in New York, but it's good for the plants, good for the environment to get some water. Yeah, I'm happy I'm not going to complain that it's not sunny.
I love it. No, you have to tell yourself that at this time of year. The rain has to count for something in May, right?
Yeah. Yes, for sure. Um, Cynthia, I'm so impressed with your background and your journey and how you got here. I just would love to have you talk a little bit about, you know, your starting point of like like at 22, you were running a category, and your journey thus far that led you here. We'll break it up. I'll ask you questions in between, but would love for you just to start.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting, Seema. I have had a journey that I feel really proud of. I feel humbled by, and I feel and definitely grateful for. I did definitely start very young with a pretty high pressure, high profile job where I did manage a category, a pretty large category that's much bigger now than what I managed back then when I was 22. But starting in a very high profile job, in a job that allowed me to get really close to customers, it made me fall in love with what I get to do now 20 years later, and that is connect the dots between consumer intimacy and business strategy. So, yeah, I started my career at Bath& and Body Works, where I was actually one of the first merchants to ever run the antibacterial hand collection, which is now just the hand soap collection. But I was very fortunate to work for who I believe are some of the best merchants in the industry. They took a chance on me at a young age after interning while I was at Ohio State in undergrad. They said, "Hey, Cynthia, do you want to join the merchant team?" And I would definitely not say no to these people. So I said yes. And quite frankly, I learned how to do my job by watching the best in the industry do their jobs. And I'm so grateful it wasn't during COVID times because whatever they were doing for their business, I just copied and did it for my business and it all worked out. Right. And so yeah, I look back on that time, Seema, and just realized that really did catapult my career. So from Bath and Body Works, I decided I loved launching products. I loved connecting the dots between consumer intimacy and what happened from a strategic standpoint, but I wanted to do it more globally. So I went to Ohio State and got an MBA and luckily was recruited to Procter Gamble, which is where I worked in consumer market knowledge. Got to go very deep from a consumer intimacy standpoint once again. And long story short, I left P&G to do some more brand work. My mom got sick, so I wanted to get closer to home. And in doing so, I went back to the brand management side of the house and spent a couple of years going to a couple of different companies and managing brands. And while that was incredible, it all led me to what I'm doing now. And that's running an agency that serves many different verticals, some of which include retail and CPG. But we also do some work for some pharma companies, some insurance companies, spirits and beverage companies, a little bit of everybody. So, yeah, I could not have predicted this path, but I'm incredibly grateful.
I love it. And I wanna just for our we do have young listeners that are starting out and trying to figure out their career. When you were offered that position at 22, did you realize the significance of that? Or were you like, can you just give a little bit of like your mindset on that one?
Yeah. Oh gosh, Seema, I have to go back a couple of decades to think about my mindset. You know, I don't know that I did realize the significance. I look back on it now and I have a close friend who we grew up together as young merchants in the business. And she and I talk about it all the time. We always kind of wonder where the old merchants went. Well, because I think we were just kind of enjoying what we were doing and having fun being young and bringing young ideas to the business. But sometimes you don't notice the gravity of a thing until you look back on it. I certainly knew it was an important job at that time. I don't know exactly how they run the business now, but at that time, the merchants were kind of the center of the wheel, meaning, I interface with everybody in the business to some capacity. And so I knew I had a great responsibility, but I
Mm.
did not know the gravity of it. I didn't realize that with one request, I could spend somebody's entire day. So yeah, I think hindsight is 2020, but at the time, I just wanted to make my boss proud.
Yeah, and the cool part is that you probably gave your heart and soul into it, not really realizing the magnitude of what that job was, but said, "Okay, this is a huge opportunity. I'm gonna dive in and really do the best I can do." And actually, your intro into market research, taking surveys and getting feedback from people in terms of their response to the products.
Yeah, very true, very true. Yeah, it's interesting, Seema. I think respect for other people goes such a long way. And the person who created the role for me, I'm still actually very close to 20 years later. And I ask him sometimes from time to time, what made you take a chance on me? And he does say that. He says, I knew you would work hard. I knew you were smart. I knew you would figure it out. So, yeah, I think it's a product of being raised by entrepreneurs. My dad was an entrepreneur. And so I was always around this kind of hardworking work ethic, and I don't know any other way. There are days that I wish I could have a soft life, but it wouldn't be congruent with who I am at my core. And so, yeah, I am, like I said, incredibly grateful that I do have a figure it out kind of attitude.
Yep. So let's talk about CMK and your role at Procter and Gamble because that's huge that you got that role. It's the cream of the crop, and many times I understand it to you have a seat at the table, basically, in terms of providing a perspective on a business decision. Can you just share a little bit more of what it was like on the client side? And having vendors help you figure out your perspective, as it related to making, suggestions around business decisions.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, Procter& Gamble was definitely the gift that keeps giving. It's the way I really think about the business. I made some of my life's best friends there at P&G, and I certainly learned a lot of discipline in terms of decision making at P&G. And you're right. The CMKers, they definitely have a seat at the table, which I now know is actually not typical for a lot of businesses. There are some companies, the smarter ones, in my opinion, do allow their consumer insights people to have a seat at the table, but that's just how P&G does business. And so, it was beautiful to be in a culture and in an environment where they cared about the consumer voice with every big decision they make. They still care about the consumer with every big decision they make. And so it's interesting. It was my first kind of foray into hiring external people to also care a lot about the brands I was working on. I before had the full responsibility of being the kind of brand owner or the
Or
uh,
Yep.
op- opinion in the room on what's to happen on a brand. But at P&G at that time, I think it's now changed, but they worked a lot with external suppliers. And so, I did have to take recommendations from others who had worked with other suppliers in terms of not just who could get the work done, but who could help me feel comfortable about doing my job well. And so, I do think that when you're client side, you, yes, need the work to be done, but you also need a partner who's going to help you be better at your job. And I certainly learned that at P&G. It's interesting because I always tried to treat suppliers well. It's one thing I really prided myself on. And so many of them still kind of reach out and, kind of have thoughts. And now that I'm on the other side, I like to think I'm reaping good karma from treating people well. Oh,
I believe in
yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, it was definitely an interesting experience. Yeah, it's when you're working in a brand, and I'm sure you've observed this over the years, but there are a lot of stakeholders that care a lot about the brand's health, right? There's obviously the internal stakeholders, but if you're lucky, you'll work with suppliers that feel like they also have some skin in the game. And so I definitely learned that at P&G for sure.
I think when I was at IBM, I really appreciated the vendors or suppliers that understood the challenges that I was facing in terms of trying to communicate the results of a segmentation that might have been different than a segmentation that was done 5 years ago versus, "Here's a segmentation, good luck." Uh,
Mhm.
I'd love to get your perspective on, what sitting you're now on the other side of it, but sitting in the client role, what what tips do you have for vendors or suppliers as it relates to helping their customer advance their agenda and basically help them do a better job?
Yeah, great question. Certainly one that I should sit and journal about a little bit more, Seema. But, I do think you have to think beyond the brief. When you're a supplier to these brands, you absolutely should know the brief in and out, but
Yeah.
you should also ask for context beyond the brief itself. I can think of a few times. particularly at P&G, where what brand equity was saying was not the same thing that my consumption numbers were saying. And so I had to figure out how to make those things connect because it's an investment to invest in things like a brand equity tracker, right? And so at that time, I had good relationships with suppliers that were willing to go beyond the brief alone to help me create a story that made sense. So I think the first piece of advice I would have is to go beyond the brief. Make it your duty to insert yourself as a part of the team so that you're thinking beyond the objective on your current research assignment. I think additionally, humility goes a long way, Seema. I think just being willing to say when you know something well and when you might need to
Yeah.
spend some time getting a bigger answer. I think a lot of times suppliers want to feel like they're the smartest person in the room. And certainly at this point, I myself have gained a lot of experience, but I'm not always the smartest person in the room. I still have to follow up sometimes. I still have to go out and get more data to make an informed recommendation. And I think that goes a long way. When I was buying research, I wanted to know that suppliers were both competent and humble. So I think that's the other piece of advice I would give.
I love it. I love it. Okay, so you were on this brand management track that
Mhm.
like and life changed. You decided to travel for a year. Am I recalling that correctly?
You are the best year of my life.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah.
What inspired
Yes.
you? What motivated you? I know you were still doing research while you were traveling, but
Mm.
yeah, it'd be great to just understand a little bit of that.
The short story is an Instagram ad inspired me. But the longer answer is I was actually living in Baltimore, Maryland at the time, and I was in a role I really liked, quite frankly. It was an innovation role on a brand that I really loved and have always had a fond affection for. And the team was incredible. I liked most of who I was working with, which was beautiful. But I just always felt like I could be a better asset to brands if I were external to the brands, if I could be more objective in how I made recommendations, right? I think when you're on the inside, you say you're being objective, but the truth is, there's a whole lot of political things that go into how you make recommendations. I very much so like to be objective in how I do work. And so I started getting Instagram ads for something called Remote Year, which no longer exists. But at the time, it was a program where you could go to different countries every month for a year and you bring your job and they do everything else for you. So they set up our office environment, they found apartments. And so here I was, I flew to Croatia, split Croatia on a whim, and met who are
Favorite.
now some of my closest friends on this trip. Some of them were investment bankers, some worked in PR, some were software developers, but we all just wanted to immerse in cultures globally. And so I was doing a lot of work digitally at that point because my bills still came. Even though I wasn't in America, my bills still were here. And so I did. I took on a bunch of freelancing projects. I did a lot of focus groups, a lot of in depth work. And this was all in 2019, SEMA, which looking back on it again, my timing couldn't have been more perfect because when I got back in February of 2020, a lot of my friends in industry, former employers, they all said, Cynthia, we have to get our research online and we need to figure out how to do it. We don't know what you're doing, but we know you're doing it from South Africa. So teach us, help us figure this out.
Yeah.
And so what I thought SEMA was going to be a year of a break actually turned into me focusing on growing 828. And so it was in 2020 when I made my first hire. And here we are 6 years later. And, I'm very fortunate that if we can say that we're here 6 years later. So
Yeah,
many people
that's
can't say
huge.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, do you remember the point in time where you made the decision to say, I'm going to go from like freelancing to actually establishing a company? Do you
Yeah. That's
a moment?
I do somewhat. So again, when I got back in February 2020, I somewhat had an intention to go back to corporate America. I thought, hey,
Mm.
I had my year off. It was fun, but I missed being in the energy of other thinkers. And not that my friends weren't thinkers, they're super smart people, but we
In
just,
your profession, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so I actually interviewed for a role and was offered the role. And it was in a tech company. And the long story short is this was, I don't know, maybe March or April of 2020. As you can recall, the world was crumbling around us, or so we thought. Things felt unstable. I was still getting freelance work, but the job went away. The long story short is they had to make some budget cuts, and the job that I thought I was gonna head to next no longer existed.
Yeah.
So that was the moment, Seema, that I felt like, you know what, this is going well. I believe if I set an intention and really go after growing this thing, it might grow. And so I took a risk and I leaned in and it was scary. It was scary because at that point I had only known corporate America.
Right.
But I am fortunate to be surrounded by entrepreneurs that encouraged me to take the leap. And
Awesome.
here I am.
So let's talk about the thesis of your company. You started it. You obviously there's core principles, there's areas of focus. Can you just share a little bit about that in terms of, how does somebody think about your company? Why are you different?
So what makes us different? Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think there's the what I hope makes us different, but then there's what I think our clients might say about working with us. So what I hope makes us different is that people know that we execute beyond the brief. Is we try to be very culturally intelligent in everything that we do. We ask consumers questions every day, all day, but we also kind of look at the context by which they are giving us answers. And so for us, that looks like looking at things that are happening in culture, looking at historical data points that perhaps help us understand what a person's saying today. I just talked to somebody earlier today, a veteran on behalf of a pharmaceutical company, and there was what he said in that interview, but then there's the
Yeah.
additional context of him being a veteran and him being in the situation he's in that allows us to kind of tell a different story. So I think the culturally intelligent piece is different. And then I think our clients would say that we're super agile. I think you know this, but I keep my team pretty small, but we have a collective of people that we work with too. So we're able to let every dollar that comes to us go towards research, mostly go towards research. I can recall a lot of times hiring agencies that would bring 10 people to the room for a meeting, but only 2 people would talk.
Right.
And so I really wanted to create a situation where we had who we needed in the room when we needed them and not an army of other people. So, I think those are the 3 things that make us a bit different.
I love that. I love that. And
Yeah.
and I think it's I always love talking to women founders. And obviously you're a woman founder and a woman of color. And how does that factor into kind of your journey, if you will? And in some ways it's an unfair question because like your journey and you might not know somebody else's journey. But how do you perceive it to be if it's different or not?
Yeah, that's a great question and one that I will perhaps reflect on even after this conversation. Yeah, I think there are a couple things that come to mind. The first is being a female founder and being a Black female founder gives me a different point of view because there's just not very many of us in this industry. So I think coming in, there's already a little bit of an advantage in that. I don't think like everybody else. I mean, and that's just because of lived life experiences, right? But I also think that, it has allowed me to kind of feel more confident in rooms, so to speak, because I know that I'm the only person that has had a lived experience of a Black woman, right? And again, as a Black woman founder, that just adds an additional layer of depth to what I'm able to bring into the room. So, in some respects, I kind of think of it as my superpower. I
Awesome.
think
Yeah.
certainly we can talk all day about the inequities that exist because they do exist. And
Yeah.
I do think that it is true that we sometimes have to work a little harder to get half as far. But again, as I said earlier, I'm kind of built for that. I had a dad who made me shoot 100 foul shots a day for discipline. So, so discipline is not something that I shy away from. But I do, in some respects, feel like it's my superpower. I think the challenging aspect on the other side of it is when people make assumptions about who I am or who we are as an agency based on who I am as a Black woman, right? I think there are times that people think that all we do is this type of work, right? But the truth of the matter is, once they've commissioned us for, call it an African American project, they then see how we execute work and say, well, by the way, let's see if they can do this general market work as well, right? So, yeah, I think if there's a challenge, it is the perceptions that other people have about who we are as a team, which again, I feel like it is a superpower to be a Black female founder. But I can't spend my time worrying so much about other people's perceptions. I spend the majority of my time figuring out how we can show up authentically, how we can show up in a way that represents not just ourselves well, but hopefully open doors for other people to also
Yeah.
penetrate our industry.
I love that. I also like I always have this philosophy, focus on the things you can control. You can't control people's perceptions. Like everybody has their own personal narrative to a situation, and the thing that I can control is how I show up and how I want to conduct myself in a way that is authentic to me and good for business. Um it, it took a while to get there, but sure. That's it.
Yeah, and it's interesting what a powerful stance that is, Seema, to, kind of release the expectations of others and just kind of show up as yourself. I feel, have a better life experience when you live life that way.
Fine.
I have a spiritual teacher that I listen to from time to time. His name is Lao Tzu, and he says, "When you let go, it all gets done." And I think the same can be true. If I held on to what people thought about me as a Black founder, I would have quit a couple years ago, right?
Sure.
but
Yeah.
but what I hold on to is the fact that we work really hard to refine our craft and to deliver solid results for people, and that's frankly where I spend the majority of my energy.
I love that. I love that. Okay, so let's talk about AI and the future of research. What are your thoughts, perspectives? I know it's a hot topic, but it's actually it's a technology that's basically in both consumer and business world. So it's not, and from my perspective, it's not just a shiny object. It's here, and I would love to know your perspective on it.
Yeah, it absolutely is here, and frankly, I use a version of AI every day. Yeah, it's definitely here. It's a part of our lives, and it's interesting, Seema. I feel like over the past year or so, perhaps year and a half, we've seen the narrative on AI within our industry shift quite significantly. If we would have had this conversation a year ago, I think people would have still been very reticent to embrace any sort of AI. I think we all want to feel like we're bringing unique values to the table. But what I've realized personally, and what I try to instill in the people I work with is leveraging AI allows me to do more of what I do uniquely. And it allows me the space and the margin to be able to show up as a human. So I think it's important that we embrace the advances of AI without forgetting that at the end of the day, nothing can replace the human experience. And so, yeah, I'm personally very excited about it. I'm excited about the efficiencies that it's creating. I'm certainly cognizant of the missteps that could happen as a result of AI. I think, we're still learning. We're still in the beginning phases of what I think AI is really going to be. But just again, controlling the controllables, as you alluded to earlier, I think is incredibly important. But yeah, we're super energized about it. We're super hopeful. It also gives me confidence that what we do well, which is connect humanity to brand decisions, will still be incredibly important in the future.
I totally agree with you, and I also think in some like, I love your thesis on you can't mimic the human experience and human experience related to brands, and I think we're still trying to figure out how to articulate that in a scalable way, uh, versus kind of the overall, "Oh my gosh, what is AI gonna do to our industry?" Like, what will our jobs be? And and to your point, you actually get to focus on the stuff that's probably more creative, more emotional based, more, um, it connecting the dots from a business perspective. Uh
100%. I mean, I'll share something. Somebody just today, Seema, wrote on LinkedIn, they were talking about the importance of in-person ethnography. And from the post, I gather that this person had traveled the globe to go into homes. And this is something they hadn't done since before the pandemic. And I can say in my own experience, even that I've seen strategies change by taking executives into homes, right? You can try to sell a data point all you want, and data points are now quite ubiquitous. We all have access at our fingertips to the big kind of sea of data that's out there, but very few people can point to a lived experience that has changed their mind about a thing. And
Yeah.
so that's why I think they have to kind of work congruently together. We shouldn't
Mm.
shy away from AI and the efficiencies that it can use in the process of doing work. But I also think we can't lose the context of the fact that we are humans still selling to humans. And the way you do that best, in my opinion, is by creating human focused experiences.
I love it. I love it. Cynthia, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciated the time that we've got to prep together, see each other at conferences and now do this interview. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thanks for thinking of me, Seema. It's been my pleasure to be a guest.
Thank you.
Take care.